I did, Mr. Q. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. It's nice
Hi.
to see everyone.
Oh.
Just waiting for some people to join us on Facebook and YouTube.
Hey, if that's you out in the woods.
Sure video.
There, now I have everything set up properly, I think. Oh, here we go. A bunch of people joining us. Nice to see everyone tonight. So some people joining us on Zoom, some people joining us on Facebook, some people on YouTube. So it's nice to see everyone. My apologies for missing you last week. I had an appointment that ran overtime, and I will be revealing to you in a week or so what that appointment was all about. And it does have something to do with radically changing my appearance as Mrs. Q. Some of you know I've been trying to reproduce some of those hairstyles of the late 18th century where the ladies used pink or blue hair powders in order to alter the color of their hair, and that it doesn't work too well on my wigs because they are so dark. So I had to find an alternative and a way to try to reproduce that for you. And I have found a way, but it is a very shocking method that I decided on. So I think I'll be unveiling that for you next Friday. Although if any of my neighbors are watching, they have already seen it. So you might be able to guess what I did. So it's very shocking. So let's see, we have a bunch of people with us tonight. This is wonderful to see everyone. Tonight we are going to be talking about, it's Mr. and Mrs. McCabe. Hello, it's good to see you. It's good to see you too. It's good to see everyone. I recognize so many names here. So many of you are regulars, and you know, I appreciate it so much that you join me on these Friday nights. So I was quite distressed at having to miss you last week, but when you see why, I think you'll be quite, if not impressed, at least amused at the reason I missed everyone last week. So we're going to talk about tonight freedom of the press and the importance of freedom of speech, even and especially for the people you do not like, and how some of that repression led us to the American Revolution. Let me move up a little bit further. I think I've told you before that I sit on a chair with a couple of pillows on it, and I have a little support under my feet, so I'm kind of precariously balanced here to make everything look good. So excuse me if I wiggle around a little bit until I find my place. So today is, oh, look, we have people. Oh, my good friend Karen from Atlanta is watching tonight. This is wonderful. Hi, Karen. Who else is here? Oh, and Mr. Eisenstein from New Jersey. People from everywhere. Thank you guys so much for watching. So we're going to talk about freedom of the press, but first, it is both in Mrs. Q's life and in my personal life, my wedding anniversary today. And I think for Mr. and Mrs. Q, it's about 250 years now that we have been married. And one of the things we like to talk about is why Mr. Q and I have been together as long as we have and are still very happy together. And one of those things does have to do with free speech, doesn't it? And knowing when to say things and when not to say things. And I think all of the ladies who have been married for some time here tonight, and those of you who are planning one day to be married, a good thing to remember is that we ladies and our gentlemen husbands do not always see life the same way as we are men and women, and we do experience life differently, and that can lead us sometimes to be rather impatient with each other. And so it's a very important thing to allow our husbands to speak their mind and to accept that with a good nature and respond with kindness and good nature to whatever our husbands are talking about, if we agree with them or not. And one of those things is the secret to keeping a good marriage, to putting your husband or your relationship ahead of your own desire to be right, because in the long run, being right is not nearly as important as a happy and stable marriage. So speech has a lot to do with keeping a good marriage together for a long time. And I think the McCabe's know what I'm speaking about, is they have had a very long and successful marriage as well. And I'm sure they know what I'm trying to get at here. So it's good to, respond graciously, allow your spouse, gentlemen as well, to speak what's on their mind and to respond with love and respect. It's a refusal to listen and to communicate that leads to problems in marriage and leads to problems in life everywhere. Oh, and here we have Rhode Island as well. Hello, hi everyone tonight. It's so great to see everybody every week. I missed everyone so much last week. It felt terrible missing everybody. So I'm glad to see everyone back this week. So really in life, that becomes a problem as well, right? When people are not allowed to speak freely. And part of that in American colonial life, a big part of that, Mrs. Rankich, I miss seeing you too. Thank you, from Georgia. We have a few people tonight from Georgia, a few ladies from Georgia tonight watching. So for us, the big change in that status was the trial of the printer, John Peter Zenger, which was, of course, even before my time in the year 1735. And the trial of Mr. Zenger all started with our governor, William Cosby. And here is Governor Cosby for you all to see. Governor Cosby was the governor of incredibly New York and New Jersey for a time. And as soon as he arrived in New York, he found himself in trouble with the locals, which isn't such a hard thing to do, to find yourself in trouble with the locals here in New York. But he found himself in trouble with the locals and with the acting governor, Rip Van Dam, and they found themselves in a dispute over finances, specifically how they would each be paid for their services, as Mr. Van Dam had filled in for Mr. Cosby from the time he'd been appointed to the time he took his position. And they had a dispute over how those payments ought to be made. The dispute made its way into court, and 2 of the 3 sitting justices decided for Governor Cosby, and 1 decided for Mr. Van Dam. And Mr. Cosby removed that justice from the court and replaced him with someone he knew would be more favorable to him in the future. Now, to you in the future, you might find this shocking that a governor might just be able to add and remove people to a court, but that's the way it was before the Revolutionary War and the Constitution. Keep in mind, right, that the king is there by divine right of kings, or the grace of God, or the will of God, and the king's appointees in the colony, specifically the governors, carry that authority with them as well. And although the rules changed from colony to colony, Cosby felt he had the right to change these judges on the court in New York. So the judge that he removed and some of his friends began writing articles critical of Cosby in a newspaper called the Weekly Journal. And here's a copy of the Weekly Journal. And the Weekly Journal was put out every week by Mr. John Peter and Mrs. Anna Zenger. And eventually the Weekly Journal became quite vociferous in their criticism of Governor Cosby and began exposing corruption he was involved in and making brutal fun of him, his supporters, and his appointees. Mr. Cosby, like many people who are not suited for the positions they're in, was very thin-skinned and unable to accept the criticism, and ordered the printer, Mr. Zenger, jailed for libel. And when Mr. Zenger's trial came up, or I should say his bail hearing came up, he was denied bail. His bail was so high he could never pay it. And the 2 lawyers defending him were both disbarred from defending him at that time, Mr. Smith and Mr. Alexander. So you can see here, it looks like we are in the midst of an incredible set up on the part of corrupt parties in the colony of New York. The governor who has now replaced the members of the court, and the court who has now disbarred the best lawyers capable of defending Mr. Zenger. So you can kind of see how this is building on itself. Well, eventually Mr. Zenger was defended by a lawyer from Philadelphia, Mr. Andrew Hamilton, and the trial did take 9 months to litigate. Well, during those 9 months, Mrs. Zenger, great lady as she was, put out the weekly issue of the paper without missing a single issue. She and an apprentice managed to put out the weekly journal during the entire period of confinement of Mr. Zenger. And I don't know if you know, but in 1735, printing a newspaper was a very physically intense job, laying all the type, moving the big sheets of paper through the printer, hanging them all up, a very labor-intensive job. But Mrs. Zenger never missed an issue. Each week, she would go to her husband's jail cell, sit on the outside of it, and together they would go through the stories that were submitted, decide what to print, and decide on the layout of the paper. So Mr. Cosby's entire purpose in jailing Mr. Zenger was to stop the publication of the weekly journal, which was disturbing him more and more every week. And he failed at that, thanks to the great Anna Zenger, who continued putting out that newspaper while her husband was in jail. And at the end of the 9 months of the trial, the jury in New York deliberated for only 15 minutes. They set Mr. Zenger free, and they redefined what a libel was in New York, or what I should say the legal term for libel was in New York. And they said that a libel was only a libel if it was a purposefully printed falsehood. If it hurt you and it was true, it could not be a libel. If it was false, but the printer didn't know it was a libel, the printer was not prosecutable for that libel. Only the author who knew the item was false could be prosecuted for libel. So this set the printers free of charges of libel. And as they continued printing things that were submitted to them anonymously, they were able to print pretty much whatever they wanted to from that time forward, claiming that, of course, they had no knowledge when they printed it that it was a falsehood. So the newspapers at that time in 1735 were set free here in the colony of New York. But that didn't stop the attempt at repression of the freedom of the press. Because we know, of course, that people who want to stop criticism of themselves will go to all ends to try to do that. So methods were still used to try to prevent speech that was critical of government appointees. And of course, why would they do that? Why? To protect their corruption, of course. I mean, many of them are in their positions due to nepotism or, cronyism or all kinds of reasons, and are completely incapable of doing their jobs, or see their jobs as a route to corruption and personal gain. And the last thing they want is any examination, public examination of what they are doing. So of course they will look for other ways now to stop that criticism. Honest people employed in public service don't need to hide their activities from examination. Only those who are corrupt seek to keep you from knowing what they're doing. So the next step in this was the suppression of the independent reflector. And here I have the independent reflector. Now, just a little bit of New York minutia for you here concerning the independent reflector. The independent reflector got into their problems in 1753. So that is about 27 years later. The lawyers who were defending Mr. Zenger, James Alexander and William Smith, were the lawyers who taught the three gentlemen who wrote the independent reflector. So we've moved on to a generation of talented, we may say radical lawyers. So the three authors of the independent reflector were William Livingston, who some of you may know was the father also of John Jay, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Smith and John Moran Scott, a major general in the Revolutionary War, three brilliant young lawyers. Well, for about 18 months, they put out their weekly paper, as you see here, the Independent Reflector, which dealt with all sorts of issues that were important to the town here. One of the biggest series of issues that they published concerned the opening of our first college, King's College, and the fact that it was an Anglican school paid for by tax money that would be collected from all New Yorkers, regardless of their religious background, which was quite controversial and led to some negotiations being made to, let's say, make the opening of King's College a little smoother. King's College in your time is Columbia College of Columbia University. Both Alexander Hamilton and John Jay attended that school. But here we have 1753-54, the gentleman in the Independent Reflector bringing up all kinds of topics that various people do not want to discuss. And after 18 months of the Independent Reflector, enough people were angered by these subjects that no printer would print another copy. So although no one was sued for libel and no one was placed in jail for sedition or seditious libel or falsehoods, no one would print the paper. And that was a very effective way of stopping the newspaper, wasn't it? What generally happened at that time was that everyone associated with a powerful political faction would stop using a printer's services, because printers didn't really make all of their money on newspapers, but on other types of printed materials and documents. So if no one will use your services, you will have no business. And that was the leverage that was used, or the coercion, we might say, used against printers. So after 18 months of excellent work, the Independent Reflector was no more. But the three gentlemen, the Whig triumvirate who printed it, certainly went on to other great things, far longer than the Independent Reflector. So the struggle for the free press continued in New York. Excuse me. And the next attempt to squelch free discussion came with this broadside: to the betrayed inhabitants of the city and colony of New York. And now we are 15 years after the debate over King's College. So now we're in the year 1769. Now, the broadside you see here, to the betrayed inhabitants, as we know it, was written by one Alexander McDougall, a truly great man, a self-made man, a gentleman who came from Scotland as a peasant, earned his way, became one of the most popular ship captains in the port of New York, a very wealthy man, a leader of the Presbyterian community, a founder of the New York Sons of Liberty, and later commander of the 1st New York Division of the Continental Army and president of the Bank of New York. So a fine gentleman. But in 1769, when he was about 38 years old, he wrote this 2-page broadside that you see here, to the betrayed inhabitants. And to the betrayed inhabitants was a truthful and honest expose on, oh, what's the word? I want to find a good word, on mischief that had gone on in New York earlier that year concerning our elections, in which there was quite a deal of mischief, or one might say corruption or election fraud, on the part of a specific political faction called the Delanceys, who were the opponents to the Livingstonites, or William Livingston's family, one of the lawyers who wrote the Independent Reflector. Their two families generally controlled the politics of our town. The Delanceys that year used all sorts of enticements, shall we say, to get people to vote for them, paying for their campaigns, giving family members jobs, giving them outright bribes, things of that nature, and as a result, won the election. Captain McDougall chronicled all of that in his broadside and went on to show that once the Delanceys had control of our New York Assembly, they went on to do things that were not in the interests of the people, but in the interests of the king and the parliament and the aristocracy of England, of which they were very closely aligned through marriage. And he talks about some very specific things the Delancey did in that manner that harmed the people of New York while benefiting the Parliament and aristocrats. Now, everything in here, I would say, as I recall it, was completely true that he wrote in here. There are no lies in Captain McDougall's paper. Yet the Delancey government declared it to be a lie, a falsehood. They came out and said, this is a falsehood. This is a false, malicious, and seditious libel, which was the only way after Zenger to have someone arrested for libel, was to say it was false and malicious. In other words, Captain McDougall wrote everything here knowing it was false, and it was also seditious, and that it was undermining the activities of the government. So interesting. So how do we know if Captain McDougall is telling the truth or the politicians are telling the truth when they say it's all false? Well, how do we know? Well, only those of us who were alive at the time to witness the election fraud would know, and the votes of the assembly, of course, would know that Captain McDougall was telling the truth. Yet by law, it was now a falsehood, as the government declared it a falsehood, and Captain McDougall was arrested. He had a bail hearing, as all gentlemen were entitled to, and ladies at that time, and he could well afford to pay the bail, but he refused to pay the bail, and he said he would rather go back to jail for the cause of liberty and go to trial for this than pay the bail. This made him hugely popular here in New York and our surrounding colonies. And for 4 months, Captain McDougall sat in the jail while his friends in the Sons of Liberty every day conducted various types of celebrations for him on the sidewalk in front of his jail window, his cell window. Eventually, Captain McDougall was freed because the only witness that he was the author to this broadside was the printer James McEvers. Mr. McEvers said that he himself was tortured and forced to give up the name of the author of the broadside. So he says he gave up the name in fear of his life. But then he died before he was called as a witness. And as you know from the common law, if there's no witness to a crime, then no crime has occurred. Someone has to be witness of it. And now all charges against Captain McDougall were dropped. Although if there was a trial, perhaps he would have been found guilty, depending upon who with ties to the Delancey family may have sat on his jury. So in your time, when you read something like this, it's very difficult for you to know which is true and which is not. Is McDougall's story true, or is the Delancey family's story true? It's very hard in the future to know until you look back to our time and look at more firsthand accounts of people who lived through those events. So the Delancey family had an interest in making this false, didn't they? Because if this was false, people would not want to investigate further into the potential fraud that took place in the election of 1769 and might not be so on the lookout for fraud in future elections. So of course it was in their interest for people to believe this was false. In Captain McDougall's mind, it was in the interest of the free people to know this was true, so that they would be on the lookout for election mischief the next time around. Of course, Captain McDougall knew the election could never be overturned, but his desire was that people would know and be on the lookout for these kinds of things in future elections, which we were and we weren't, depending on the year, as time went by. These things have always been a problem here in New York, the issue of election veracity or election fraud. Now, I want to look through, I took some notes on things I wanted to be sure to talk to you about, and I want to make sure I didn't miss any. Oh, so I made a note to myself here to talk to you about how if you say something is false, and then you have the person jailed, you are already adding legitimacy to your own argument. Because if the person can be jailed for what they said, many people will believe that they violated the law. Because many people will say, well, Captain McDougall wouldn't be in jail if he didn't do something wrong. Because they trust and they believe in the common law, and they believe in the people that we have selected to carry out those laws. So just by getting the person declared in violation of the law and getting them jailed, Even if they don't go to trial, there were people who still believed later that Captain McDougal had committed sedition against the government by writing this. In other words, his reputation could never be fully restored because he had been jailed. So we can see that perhaps as a tactic to degrade those who are shining a light on your bad activities, in order to, even if you lose, still have them a bit tarnished after the events have concluded. And we see that happen here with Captain McDougal. I wanted to mention that to you today. And so why would a guilty party work so hard? Or let's say before they're guilty, let's say a party being accused of corruption works so very hard to keep anyone from talking about it. Well, what defense do they have? They have no defense. So all they can do is stifle the speech of those who are shining the light. Isn't that true? Because all you have in your defense are your activities, are the things you've done. And if they are indeed corrupt, they will only convict you. They won't clear you, where a person who has not done anything corrupt can easily show the evidence of their honesty and diffuse the arguments of their opponent with their own honest argument in return. Which brings me to the need for that honest, open, and free speech, as that was the reason, or I should say one of the reasons, for the rebellion here that led us to our war with England. If you recall, our grievances here in the colonies were not allowed to be properly aired on the floor of the House of Commons and properly debated in Parliament. And as those grievances were refused time and time again, it caused dissent, frustration, anger, disagreement, and repressed anger. And we know that repressed anger leads to rebellion. Correct? I mean, even in our personal relationships, right? So if I go back to Mr. Q and me, if I'm upset with Mr. Q about something and I don't tell him, and he doesn't have an opportunity to talk to me about it, and I just let that anger grow and grow, well, eventually I will likely get angry at him for other things that are basically meaningless. So the importance is airing those differences, giving both parties an opportunity to talk about them and to fully express what they are experiencing. We were not allowed that. The colonies were not allowed to do that. And the only place we were capable of doing that, the Parliament, because there was no one else who could address those grievances but the Parliament itself. And if the Parliament would not hear them, it would not let us speak. That grew and grew in the colonies. That repression grew and grew. It combined with other angers over taxes, angers over quartering troops, angers over searches and seizures of property, things like that, that then led to the explosion that became the American Revolution. So when it came time later, after the American Revolution, to create our Constitution, it was our governor, George Clinton, and I have a portrait of George Clinton here for you, looking very elegant there. It was our governor, George Clinton, who questioned many things in the Constitution and desired that some things not expressly mentioned there ought to be added in the form of amendments. So you see in the First Amendment of the Constitution is the guarantee of that free political speech and free speech in the public sphere. So let me say, earlier in the 18th century, that rule was also used to try to stifle religious speech. And that we had 2 Presbyterian pastors who were arrested for preaching with the door open so that everyone on the street could hear their Presbyterian message, which was in conflict with the Church of England. And they were arrested for that. And their trial found them not guilty, which then paved the way in New York for our idea of free religious speech free religious practice, and free association all go hand in hand. Free speech, free press, free religious practice, freedom of association, all go together to ensure a free people and a stable country. Because when any of those things become out of balance and people feel repressed and feel that angry repression, it sows the seeds for rebellion. So our gentlemen who wrote the Constitution and added the amendments were wise enough to understand what led to the anger here and look for a way to try to secure that from happening again in the future. Let me see. What else do I have? Oh, how could I forget? The potential repression of speech and lies over the Tea Act. One of the greatest eras in our history of this charade with Great Britain that we actually had rights under the crown. The Tea Act, which we were told was for our own benefit, because if the East India Company went out of business, the British Empire would fail, and who would take care of us here in the colonies? Which of course we knew was all falsehoods. Of course, more of it. Time and time again, we see this practiced against us here in the colonies. And instead of listening to our grievances over the Tea Act and the reasons Boston threw all that tea into the harbor, our conversation was met with bayonets and cannon, wasn't it? On the green of Lexington and Concord, and later the siege of Boston. And we see where that led to the unfortunate, shall I say, dethroning of the British Empire. Would have been well suited to have listened to us rather than repressing our speech. What else did I want to tell you about tonight? I'm starting to get older and I forget in my memory some of the things I wanted to talk to you about. Oh, of course, so we know from this experience that the only way really to find the best way forward is through multiple opinions. So let us go back to the debate over our Constitution. I think this is a good example that we can use, with many voices present at the Constitutional Convention, and then many voices writing articles critical of the resulting documents. And these voices weren't just on one side or the other. They were on this side, this side, this side, this side. They came from many different directions and many schools of thought about government, about freedom, about finance, about structure of government, longevity of government, about evils of government, and all kinds of different directions these questions came. And the gentlemen who wrote the Constitution didn't refuse to answer those questions. They wrote something called in the future the Federalist Papers, where they addressed every one of those concerns, 85 of them. 85 of those Federalist Papers addressing those many different concerns, because they knew it was important for ratification of that document that all of the complaints be heard and that all of them be fairly addressed, that it is only through debate where each side goes back and forth questioning and answering and questioning and answering, is there a full airing of belief, and then an ability to negotiate a path forward. So many of you, I'm sure, read debates from that time of the Constitution or directly after, during those early presidencies, and the political debate seems very personal, very heated, very insensitive and nasty sometimes. But you see, there's always a compromise and a path forward. Why, even Mr. Madison and Mr. Hamilton were able to agree at some point on the assumption of the state debt on the part of the federal government and the creation of the national bank, something they were completely opposed to when they had their first conversations, but eventually able to find an agreement on. Because the gentlemen of that time understood the value of this. They also understood that as our Constitution was being ratified, that if any voice was prevented from being heard, why, of course, followers of that person later would point to the illegitimacy of the ratification process because all voices were not heard. And so we have these gentlemen understanding that everyone must speak, even if you intensely dislike them, even if you think they're a fool, even if you think they are a plotter and are speaking in a way to undermine you, that your best way to address this is through your own speech in return, through the use of reason, critical thinking, and evidence to show that the other person is not on the right path, that your way of seeing things is better, is more profitable, will in the end bring a better way of life for others. The only way to do that is to listen fully to your opponent and then to respond accordingly, respectfully, but clearly, and doesn't necessarily have to be kindly, although that helps, especially in a marriage, but not necessarily politically. We don't see a lot of kindness between Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams and Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Clinton and all of them, and Mr. Madison. We see quite heated debate during that time. And you may even know that Mr. Madison's good friend Patrick Henry turned against him, and their debates were very heated over the Constitution. But we still were able to move forward. And this is important in my time. It is very important in your time. So those of us who lived through this period of time, the early suppression of speech in the early 18th century, with different ways of trying to prevent newspapers from being printed. And each time those ways being overcome through our own creativity, right? Or sometimes by legal argument, the suppression of speech, the way it helped lead to anger here in the colonies and frustration, which fed into all of the other frustrations we were feeling, and eventually the Revolutionary War, which we thankfully were victorious in, and then the lessons we learned from that in establishing our new nation. We in our time very much hope that you in your time have not forgotten these lessons and understand that it is important for all people to speak. I ask, who decides what's a falsehood? If there is no concrete evidentiary proof that something is a falsehood, but simply someone saying that's false and someone saying it's true, you cannot know. You can only debate the issue until some satisfactory result comes about. And of course, tyrants, corrupt politicians, and government officials will always claim the people pointing out what they're doing are liars. Of course they will. A liar always calls a person, revealing their lies a liar. I think this is true for all time. I think they've had this issue as far back as we have recorded government from Athens and Rome. I don't think there's anything strange in that. And so we hope that you've not forgotten from our lessons how important it is to have debate and to not stifle speech, because the stifling of speech leads to rebellion. And that is something, of course, I'm sure you don't want to see in your time. As when you look back on my time, you can see how awful that was. Although we were happy we are victorious, it was an awful time for us to live through. So do you have any questions or comments? I'm seeing some good comments on Facebook telling me that it all sounds very familiar to some of you there. I'm thinking perhaps it does. If you have any questions or comments, please, send them on to me. I'm trying to find topics in my time that I think will be topical in your time. And I also want to ask you that if you're enjoying my Mrs. Q, to consider supporting my project. You can support it on PayPal and Venmo. Those are the links to that. I very much appreciate that if you do that, as Mrs. Q does need to support all the fabric dresses and various things. So your contributions are appreciated. And for those of you who have recently contributed, thank you so much. And some of you are ongoing contributors, and I appreciate your kindness and generosity more than I can actually say, which is the reason I want to be here every Friday night as a thank you to all of you for supporting my efforts. So, oh no. Oh no, Mrs. Healy tells me it's a good thing she's not on Zoom tonight, as her face would show her feelings, and she is laughing. Oh, Mrs. Healy, seeing your name. This reminds me, oh wait, Mr. Linden tells me, surely in your time, a governor would not try to hide his activities or call those who accuse him a liar. Oh, never happened, I'm sure. Oh, Mrs. Felder says she can't wait to see my new hairstyle. I think you'll enjoy it. You may be rather shocked, but you'll enjoy it. I do have an announcement to make, though, that I almost forgot about. And that is that I have spoken to Mr. Madison about joining me in New York for a walking tour. And we do have a tentative date for that. Mr. Madison cannot make it on weekdays. So it looks like we will do our tour on a Friday afternoon, probably starting in the later afternoon for those of you who may be working on Friday to perhaps exit your employment a little bit early to join us. Those of you who will be joining in person, the tour will include Francis Tavern Museum. And I think we will start there and talk a bit about the significance of Francis Tavern Museum and take a small tour of the museum and then go on and experience what New York was like during the Federalist years, 1789, 1790. We are going to live stream this event as well. So there will be in-person tickets available and live stream tickets available for you too. So I hope we'll have a good group who can attend, especially in person. I know many of you are not traveling, but for those of you in the New York City area, it would be really lovely for you to come in and join Mr. Madison and me. I know you had fun watching us a couple of weeks ago. Trust me, in person, we're even more fun together than we are on video. It should be a very informative tour. The other thing that's coming up will be the weekend before Thanksgiving, and I do not know if it will be Saturday or Sunday yet. I will be collaborating again with Francis Tavern Museum on another immersive walking tour, and this one will be celebrating Evacuation Day, the day the British finally left New York and the return of American patriots to the city of New York. Some of the people who may be appearing on that tour, I'm not quite sure yet, but I think we may have an appearance from Abraham Woodhull and Anna Smith Strong. For those of you who are fans of the Culper Spiring, I think they may be joining us from Setauket. One of my loyalist friends will be there, a gentleman who has been in the city for 7 years and will fill us in on what has been happening since I've been gone. My sister, Mrs. Van Rensselaer, will be there, as she will be in New York helping me put my home back together after my 7-year absence. And I have not heard confirmation from him yet, but we may also be joined the full tour route by Colonel Alexander Hamilton, freshly returned to New York with his lovely wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, their newborn son, Philip, and him ready to begin his law practice. I am still waiting to hear if Mr. Hamilton can make it that weekend. So that's just a little bit of a teaser of some of the things I'm working on for you in the future. So I don't think the Evacuation Day tour will be live streamed, but I'll talk to Francis Tavern about that. I'm hoping they may be interested in doing that as well, as I will have worked out the kinks on the Madison tour. So I hope you all enjoyed my little speech about free speech and how, in order to keep your marriage successful and your politics and your government stable, that everyone must be allowed the right to speak, even if you despise them and disagree with them. Mr. Jensen says, sometimes it is really hard to expose the lie. Sometimes people seek out the sensational, which makes the truth hard to come out. Mr. Jensen, that is precisely what they did with Captain McDougal. You are completely correct in that manner by issuing a formal condemnation of the broadside in the name of King George himself and ordering the arrest of the author. Why, that was so sensational that many people simply believed the charges against McDougall must have been true, that something like that would never happen to an innocent person. But by 1774, we learned that things like that were happening to many innocent people. Thank you, B. I hope you can join us for our tour with Mr. Madison. I don't have the details, but I'm thinking October 1st, starting at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But I will have more on that as the weeks go by. Mr. Kraft would like to know when the Madison tour is. I believe it will be Friday, October 1st. If not, it might be the following Friday, October 8th. But for now, we're working on October 1st, starting at about 3 p.m. New York time, which will give all of you on the West Coast, a good starting time as well. We'll start at noon your time, so it won't be very early in the morning, so that you can tune in and watch. And of course, I will be taking question submissions in advance and questions along the tour. So if the virtual part works out as we're planning, you'll be able to interact virtually with me and Mr. Madison along on that tour. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. McCabe. It's always a joy to see you. And of course, I am looking forward to seeing you in person sometime again. But this is almost as good. It's good to see you both. Thank you so much for your support and for being here. So thank you, everyone. And I will be back next week to see you, and with a topic I'll try to find that's timely for your time as well. And thank you so much. Oh, might be next year. Well, I will still be here next year, so we will see each other then. I am working on some surprising new tours too. So when you are here in person, we may have a new tour that we can do together. So something else I've been planning. Thank all of you so much, and I will see you next week. Have a wonderful week in the meantime. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and I will see you back here next week. Thank you, and goodbye to everyone.